It has been 65 days with no arrests and no named suspect. Meanwhile, online investigator Chris McDonough has spent weeks building a detailed case, yet those with the authority to respond have remained silent. What he's raising isn't just a theory, but a fundamental concern every experienced investigator understands. In any investigation, the first contact with the crime scene is critical. Get it right, and you build momentum. Get it wrong, even once, and you fall behind. According to McDonough, that's exactly what happened in the Nancy Guthrie case, where key evidence was first handled by family members. Now, 65 days later, that detail carries serious weight. FBI frameworks acknowledge a harsh reality. In kidnapping cases, the chances of finding a victim alive drop sharply after the first 72 hours. 2 months in, the case shifts, from urgent rescue to a slow, uncertain search through digital data, DNA, and unclear surveillance footage. As time passes, law enforcement grows quieter. And that silence can mean two things. Either they're closing in on something too sensitive to reveal, or the trail has gone cold. And sometimes, this is the angle online investigators are now pointing to. It's not about new clues, but about the path the investigation has been following from the very beginning. A path set in those first critical hours, and never truly questioned again. This isn't speculation. It's based on a structured, peer-reviewed framework. And it's the core argument that Chris McDonough, known online as a true crime bab, has been carefully building piece by piece. His professional credentials aren't publicly confirmed. He operates as an independent online analyst. But what makes his work stand out isn't who he is, it's the pattern he highlights. A pattern that exists in the official case record, and one that has now been independently supported by a source with far greater authority than any social media account. And before going further, one thing needs to be made absolutely clear. This is not about accusing the family. On February 16, 2026, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos publicly cleared the entire Guthrie family, every sibling, every spouse. His statement was direct and firm. The family, he said, has been cooperative, respectful, and are themselves victims. Suggesting otherwise isn't just incorrect, it's harmful. He also confirmed that DNA recovered from inside Nancy's home does not match her or anyone close to her. That question is closed. The family is not responsible. But what remains unanswered, 65 days later, is the process itself. And in a case with no arrests, process becomes everything. So we go back to where it all began. The evening of January 31st, 2026. At exactly 5:32 p.m., Nancy Guthrie walked out of her home in the Catalina foothills, just north of Tucson. And that moment would become the starting point of everything that followed. That evening began like any other. Nancy took an Uber to her daughter Annie's house. Just a simple night of dinner, games, and family time. The driver was later interviewed by investigators, something Sheriff Nanos confirmed publicly. But beyond that, no details from that conversation have ever been released. Hours later, between 9:45 and 9:48 p.m., Nancy was driven back home by family. The official timeline locks her return at 9:48. The garage door opened, and just 2 minutes later, it closed again. From the outside, everything looked completely normal. For nearly 14 hours, no one had any reason to think otherwise. Then, in the early hours of February 1st, something changed. At 1:47 a.m., the Ring doorbell camera disconnected, not due to a malfunction, but because someone was already at the door. At 2:12 a.m., another security camera detected movement. And at 2:28 a.m., Nancy's pacemaker, an internal device that transmits heart data to her phone, suddenly lost connection. At that moment may be the closest investigators have to a confirmed timeline of what happened. Because Nancy wasn't someone who could simply disappear. At 84 years old, with severe mobility limitations, she relied on daily medication and could barely walk beyond her mailbox on most days. And then, she was gone. Inside the house, everything was left behind. Her phone, her purse, her medication, still sitting on the counter. It wasn't until 11:56 the next morning that something felt wrong. A close friend noticed Nancy hadn't shown up for their regular Sunday online church service. That concern quickly turned into action. The family was contacted, and soon after, Annie and Cameron Guthrie arrived at the house, only to find that something was very wrong. For nearly an hour, the property had already been searched before anyone even made the 911 call. That call wasn't placed until 12:03 p.m., and deputies from the Pima County Sheriff's Department didn't arrive until 12:15, 12 minutes later, but crucially, somewhere between 45 minutes to an hour after the family had first entered the home. That gap of time is not just a detail, it is the question. Because in any serious criminal investigation, the integrity of a scene is everything. It is not procedural formality, it is the foundation upon which truth is built. Investigators are trained to treat every potential crime scene as fragile and irreversible. Every shifted object, every disturbed surface, every open door or smudged window may hold meaning. And anyone who enters that space before law enforcement arrives becomes an uncontrollable variable, one that cannot be reversed, reconstructed, or erased. It doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter how innocent they may seem. Protocol exists because once evidence is altered, it is gone for good. In this case, law enforcement did not encounter a pristine scene. The family did. When Annie and Cameron arrived that morning, what they found immediately suggested something far more troubling than a medical emergency. The back doors were left propped open. There was blood on the front doorstep, and the Ring camera had been forcibly torn from the wall. These chilling details were not known publicly until Savannah Guthrie revealed them on March 26, 2026, during her first interview since the disappearance, speaking with today's Hoda Kotb. And with that revelation, the timeline, and what may have been lost within it, became impossible to ignore. At first, nothing about the scene pointed to violence, at least not in the way the family understood it. Savannah described how their initial reaction was shaped by confusion, not fear. They believed Nancy may have suffered a medical emergency during the night, that paramedics had arrived, taken her out through the back door on a stretcher, and left quietly. It was an innocent explanation, one that made sense until it didn't, because then they saw the blood. And in that moment, the entire narrative shifted. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer later analyzed one of the most unsettling details: the back doors left propped open. In her view, that detail was unlikely to be accidental. It suggested intent. The doors, she argued, were most likely opened by perpetrators, possibly to create an exit route or to allow others to move in and out of the property. Nancy herself, familiar with security risks and wildlife in the area, would not have left them open. Which raises the question, were those doors held open for someone else to come through? Retired NYPD Detective Michael Alcazar pushed that idea even further. To him, a propped door does not point to a lone intruder, it suggests coordination, multiple individuals operating together. But here's what makes these expert interpretations so fragile and so critical at the same time. They are all built on a single source: Savannah's account. Because that is the only description of what the scene looked like in those first moments. Law enforcement did not witness it firsthand. They inherited it. By the time deputies arrived at 12:15 p.m., every key detail, the open doors, the blood, the missing camera, had already been seen, interpreted, and mentally processed by the family. The scene was no longer untouched. It had been filtered through human perception, shaped by shock, assumption, and fear. And that pattern of second-hand observation in those crucial early hours raises deeper questions. Because when the foundation of a case begins this way, every theory that follows, including the possibility of a ransom motive, carries that same uncertainty at its core. In the critical hours after Nancy was reported missing, while investigators were still trying to make sense of the scene, Savannah made a call to her brother Cameron. What stands out is not just the call itself, but what was said during it. Cameron already had a theory. And according to Savannah's own words in her March 26th interview, he didn't hesitate. He believed immediately that their mother had been kidnapped for ransom. This was before any official statements, before investigators had defined the situation, before a single press conference had been held. The idea of a ransom kidnapping wasn't introduced later, It was there from the very beginning, shaping how the situation was understood and communicated. That early framing didn't stay within the family. It reached investigators in those first crucial hours, subtly influencing the direction of the case. Then, 2 days later, on February 3rd, the situation took a dramatic turn. The first ransom note surfaced, sent to KOLD-TV in Tucson through a tip submission system, with TMZ receiving a copy the same day. Just days later, on February 6th, a second message arrived, this time from a different IP address, yet using similar anonymizing methods, suggesting a deliberate attempt to conceal identity while maintaining continuity. What made these messages particularly unsettling was their precision. Both notes contained details about the interior of Nancy Guthrie's home that had never been made public, specific references to where her Apple Watch was located and descriptions of a floodlight inside the house. FBI Special Agent in Charge Keith Jankowski confirmed that at least one of the notes was being treated as credible, noting it included time-sensitive demands and specific instructions tied to money. Even seasoned observers were struck by the tone. TMZ's Harvey Levin, who reviewed the first note, described it as unusually polished, its grammar flawless, its structure deliberate, layered in a way that suggested careful planning. What caught the FBI's attention most was the Apple Watch detail. Not just that it was mentioned, but how precisely its location was described, somewhere not immediately obvious to an outsider. And yet, despite all of this, one critical question remains unanswered. Law enforcement has never publicly confirmed whether these notes came from Nancy's actual captor, or from someone else entirely, someone with intimate knowledge of the home but no direct role in the abduction. Because at the time those messages were sent, the details they contained were not public. Which means whoever wrote them knew the inside of that house. And that possibility changes everything. There is, notably, an entire category of individuals, those who may have had knowledge of the home, that investigators have never publicly identified. And into that uncertainty, the family made a decision that would shape everything that followed. On February 7th, Savannah, Annie, and Cameron appeared together in an Instagram video, speaking directly to whoever might be holding their mother. Their message was clear, emotional, and unmistakable. They acknowledged receiving communication and expressed their willingness to comply. "We received your message and we understand," Savannah said. "We beg you to return our mother. We will pay." That moment mattered. Because in saying those words publicly, the family did something law enforcement had not yet formally done. They validated the ransom narrative. Before authorities confirmed the nature of the case, before any official classification was announced, the idea of a kidnapping for ransom had already taken hold in the public sphere. And it wasn't just implied, it was declared, on camera, by those closest to the victim. From that point forward, the case began to orbit around that framework. The notes were treated as real. The responses were public. And the narrative solidified. Nearly 2 months later, on March 26th, Savannah reaffirmed this belief in her first major interview, stating that she considered at least 2 of the ransom notes to be legitimate, while suggesting others may have come from opportunists trying to exploit the situation. Yet despite the weight of that belief, law enforcement has remained largely silent on the matter. No press conference has definitively addressed the authenticity of the notes since the early days. No agency has confirmed which, if any, were sent by an actual captor. And still, the ransom theory, introduced early, reinforced publicly, and repeated consistently, has remained the central lens through which both the investigation and the public interpret the case. But not everyone is convinced. Former FBI agent Harry Trombitas has pointed out that as time passes, the likelihood of a true ransom scenario appears to diminish. The risks, the complexity, the number of variables involved, it all becomes harder to sustain without mistakes. Other former agents have echoed that skepticism, highlighting a critical absence. No direct communication channel with the family, no verified proof of life, and notes being sent to media outlets instead of privately delivered. These are not typical hallmarks of a genuine ransom operation. And that contradiction, between what has been believed and what has actually occurred, may be one of the most important clues in the entire case. In traditional ransom kidnappings, the pattern is clear. Demands are immediate, direct, and unmistakable. What we see here is the opposite. The ambiguity, the indirect communication, the lack of a clear channel. These are not defining traits of a ransom case. They are deviations. And yet, the ransom narrative continues to dominate, largely because it was introduced early by the family and consistently reinforced in public. If this kind of layered analysis is what draws you deeper into the case, stay with it, because what comes next shifts the perspective even further. What we're building toward isn't speculation, but a statement made by someone who once led the Pima County Sheriff's Department, and what he revealed reframes everything discussed so far. Before getting there, though, it's critical to understand how investigators formally engaged with the family in those first days. On February 16th, the same day Sheriff Nanos publicly cleared the family as suspects, he outlined the extent of their cooperation. In an interview with KOLD, he stated plainly, investigators spoke with them, collected their phones and computers, processed their vehicles, and examined their homes. Everything, as he described it, was done. The family, he emphasized, was fully cooperative and had been cleared within the first few days. That process began even earlier. On February 7th, a court-authorized search was conducted at Annie Guthrie's Arizona property, described by officials as standard procedure. Around mid-February, FBI agents canvassed the surrounding neighborhood, going door to door after footage of a masked suspect was released. At one point, an unrelated man in Rio Rico was briefly detained, his home searched, and then released without charges. Even he publicly expressed hope that investigators would find the real suspect. All of this follows a familiar investigative blueprint. Start at the center, then expand outward. Phones, computers, vehicles, homes, neighbors, those closest to the missing person are always the first point of contact. This is not an indication of guilt, it is protocol. But in this case, the cumulative effect of that protocol reveals something more nuanced. Every step of the process flowed through the family's cooperation. They handed over devices. They opened their properties. They were the first to describe the scene. They were the ones who introduced the ransom theory. And they became the primary voices interpreting whether the communications from the supposed kidnappers were real. Even as investigators expanded their search outward, the family's influence remained central, underscored by their public statement on March 21st, urging the Tucson community to come forward with information. And in a case built on timing, perception, and narrative, that level of involvement is not just noteworthy, it is pivotal. Investigators urged the public to look closer at camera footage, personal journals, text messages, even passing conversations, anything that, in hindsight, might carry hidden significance. That appeal mirrors what law enforcement sources have quietly shared with investigative reporter Brian Enton, a long-standing belief that whoever was responsible likely came from the Tucson area, possibly even from within the same neighborhood. But that alignment raises a deeper, more complicated question. How much of this theory emerged independently from investigative work, and how much has been shaped, over time, by the family's original framing of events? That question, until recently, lingered mostly in the background. It was discussed in online circles, debated by analysts, but never directly confronted by someone with institutional authority. That changed in the past 72 hours. On March 27, 2026, Dr. Richard Carmona appeared on NewsNation during Brian Enton Investigates. And his perspective carries weight. Carmona is not a media personality or a speculative voice. He is the 17th Surgeon General of the United States and spent 3 decades within the Pima County Sheriff's Department, including years leading its SWAT team. He didn't just work in the system, he ran it. What he said during that interview was striking. The moment that troubled him most, the detail he described as perplexing to all of us, was Sheriff Nanos' public statement that he personally reopened the crime scene at Nancy Guthrie's Catalina Foothills home. According to Carmona, that is not how the process is supposed to work. Decisions about a crime scene, when it is secured, when it is released, belong to the lead investigators on the ground, the ones responsible for ensuring every piece of evidence has been documented, collected, and preserved. For a sheriff to publicly announce that step, especially on television, is highly irregular. As Carmona explained, it is typically the lead detective who determines when a scene has been fully processed, when everything has been photographed, bagged, and tagged. That protocol exists to protect the integrity of the investigation. And when it is bypassed, or even appears to be, it raises difficult questions. Not just about procedure, but about whether the foundation of the case has been handled the way it should have been from the very beginning. What Carmona was pointing to goes beyond a simple misstep. It touches the core of investigative protocol. The separation between command-level authority and forensic-level decision-making exists for a reason: to prevent influence, bias, or premature judgment from contaminating the evidence itself. When Sheriff Nanos announced he had reopened the crime scene, and then later closed it again, that reversal, according to Carmona, carried no real weight. Because once a scene has been compromised, it cannot be restored. You cannot reconstitute a crime scene, he emphasized. And in forensic work, that principle is absolute. Carmona also addressed another troubling detail: footage that had circulated showing a Domino's delivery vehicle driving across Nancy Guthrie's front lawn while the investigation was still active. To a defense attorney, he explained, that kind of breach is not minor, it is leverage. It opens the door to doubt. If unauthorized individuals were able to enter the scene, even indirectly, how can any piece of evidence be considered uncontaminated? The integrity of the space, once lost, undermines everything that follows. And what makes this even more concerning, in Carmona's view, is where these decisions appeared to originate. Not from a miscommunication on the ground, but from the highest level of local law enforcement. He described a sense of confusion, of disbelief, among those familiar with proper procedure. When leadership appears inconsistent, when statements are corrected or changed repeatedly, the damage extends beyond the investigation itself. It begins to erode public trust. And without that trust, effective leadership becomes nearly impossible. Carmona didn't stop there. He raised a separate but equally significant issue: the handling of physical evidence. According to reports, Sheriff Nanos chose to send certain materials not to the FBI for analysis, but to a private laboratory in Florida, citing cost concerns. But as Carmona pointed out, FBI forensic services are already funded through federal resources. They do not charge local agencies, which makes the decision to bypass them not just unusual, but strategically risky. Because in a case where the FBI is actively involved, diverting evidence to a separate private facility introduces a fracture in the chain of custody. And that kind of fracture is exactly what defense attorneys look for. It creates openings to challenge the validity of the evidence, to question how it was handled, and ultimately, to cast doubt on whether it can be trusted at all. In a case already defined by uncertainty, that kind of vulnerability could prove critical. Whether the decision was operational or merely administrative, it highlights a deeper issue, one that Carmona argues strikes at the heart of public confidence. Because when actions within an investigation appear inconsistent, especially at the leadership level, they don't just raise questions internally, they erode trust externally. And these concerns have not emerged in isolation. They are part of a growing wave of pressure that has been building around Sheriff Nanos for weeks. On March 24th, just days ago, that pressure became unmistakably public. The Pima County Deputies Organization, representing more than 300 members within the sheriff's own department, voted unanimously to issue a motion of no confidence and called for his immediate resignation. This was not criticism from outsiders or commentators. It came from within his own ranks, from those working inside the system he leads. At the same time, additional reporting added another layer of scrutiny. According to an investigation by the Arizona Republic, Nanos had previously resigned from the El Paso Police Department in 1982, 2 years earlier than stated on his official resume, reportedly to avoid termination tied to disciplinary issues, including excessive force, insubordination, and off-duty gambling. The sheriff's office later attributed the discrepancy to clerical errors, but the timing of the revelation only intensified the questions surrounding his leadership. Then, on Tuesday, the situation escalated further. The Pima County Board of Supervisors voted unanimously to compel Nanos to answer questions under oath, invoking a rarely used statute dating back to the territorial era, one that could potentially open a legal path toward his removal from office. Supervisor Matt Hines stated plainly that Nanos had betrayed the trust placed in him by the community. And yet, despite the mounting criticism, Nanos has remained firm. In an interview with KVOA, he dismissed the concerns, standing by both his team and the decisions made throughout the investigation. He expressed no regret, not about the handling of the crime scene, not about the timing, not about the process. And that unwavering stance, set against the backdrop of increasing internal and public scrutiny, only deepens the divide between leadership and those now questioning it. "That's just silly." That was Sheriff Nano's response. Dismissive, unwavering. Whether that feels reassuring or deeply concerning depends entirely on where you stand. But one thing is undeniable: a sitting sheriff facing a unanimous no-confidence vote from his own deputies, being compelled to testify under oath, and openly criticized by a former U.S. Surgeon General who once led the very same department. This is not a normal investigative climate. This is an investigation unfolding under visible strain, shaped by institutional fractures that cannot be ignored. And those fractures don't just affect perception, they have real implications for how evidence is handled, interpreted, and ultimately trusted. So what remains when you strip away interpretation, speculation, and second-hand accounts? What evidence exists that does not come filtered through the family's experience? The answer begins with a forensic record, specifically, data recovered independently by the FBI. Working alongside Google, investigators were able to retrieve footage from the Ring doorbell camera at Nancy Guthrie's home. Although the device itself had been physically torn from the wall, the data it captured had already been uploaded to the cloud, on Google servers. What that footage reveals is critical. A real individual, standing at the front door. A man wearing a black ski mask. The sequence is deliberate. He approaches, immediately covers the camera lens with a gloved hand, then takes an extra step, gathering nearby shrubbery and positioning it in front of the camera to block the view more completely. This was not impulsive. It was methodical, controlled. He knew exactly what he was doing. And then there's another detail, one that may seem small, but carries weight. The man is wearing a black 25-liter Ozark trail hiking backpack, a model that, at the time, was sold exclusively through Walmart. However, even that detail opens questions rather than closing them. In a March 2nd interview with NBC, Nanos himself acknowledged the limitation of that lead, noting that the backpack could have been resold or redistributed. "Who's to say," he said, "that it wasn't bought and then put on eBay?" And that is where the case stands, caught between what can be seen and what can be proven. A masked figure, a partially obscured lens, a single piece of identifiable gear. Concrete, but incomplete. In an investigation already shaped by uncertainty, even the clearest evidence still leaves critical questions unanswered. The figure captured on camera was not only concealed, he was prepared. Gloves, a black ski mask, and notably, a firearm positioned in an unusual center-waist holster, an uncommon carry style that analysts have identified as a potentially distinguishing trait. According to FBI forensic estimates, the individual stands roughly between 5 feet 9 inches and 5 feet 10 inches, with an average build. But what complicates the picture further is a second image released by investigators. One where the same individual appears without the backpack or firearm. That image, authorities confirmed, was likely taken on a different day, which suggests something far more deliberate. This wasn't a single visit. He had been there before. That detail shifts the narrative from opportunistic to calculated. Former Pima County Homicide Detective Kurt DeBra pointed to the level of preparation visible in the footage, arriving equipped, armed, and potentially after prior surveillance, as strong evidence of advanced planning. "Burglars don't show up with a full backpack," he noted. To him, the conclusion was clear. This was not a random break-in. This was a targeted kidnapping. Law enforcement appears to be operating on a similar assumption. Investigators have indicated the suspect may have been monitoring the property as early as January 11th. They have specifically asked nearby residents to review surveillance footage from that date, as well as from January 31st and the early hours of February 1st, the window surrounding Nancy's disappearance. What makes this even more puzzling is the amount of surveillance already available. Multiple cameras on the property, including those covering the back of the house, the driveway, and the front garage, were recovered and analyzed. Weeks of footage were reviewed. Family members, landscapers, pool workers, routine activity, all accounted for. And yet, none of those cameras captured the masked individual seen at the front door. So investigators are left in a strange position. They have extensive visual documentation of who came and went from the property, yet the one person they are searching for appears only in a narrow slice of that record. No clear pattern. No confirmed identity. No arrest. And that is where the case takes another turn. Because while the footage raises questions about planning and access, the next layer of evidence, DNA, may hold answers. Or, just as likely, deepen the mystery even further. One of the earliest leads to capture investigators' attention seemed, at first, highly promising: a black glove discovered about 2 miles from Nancy's home. Visually, it matched the gloves worn by the masked individual seen in the doorbell footage. More importantly, it carried DNA from an unidentified male. That sample was entered into CODIS, the FBI's massive database of over 19 million offender profiles. The expectation was clear: a hit could change everything. But none came. Investigators then turned to a more advanced method, genetic genealogy, the same approach that famously helped identify the Golden State Killer decades after his crimes. For a time, it appeared this path might unlock the mystery. Instead, it led somewhere unexpected. The DNA from the glove was ultimately traced to a local restaurant employee, someone thoroughly vetted and confirmed to have no connection to the case. Just like that, one of the most promising leads was closed. What remains is far more complex. Inside the home, investigators recovered a mixed DNA profile, genetic material that does not belong to Nancy or anyone known to be close to her. According to Sheriff Nanos, this sample may contain contributions from multiple individuals, making it extremely difficult to isolate a single, usable profile. Portions have been submitted to national databases, but once again, no matches have surfaced. Even so, authorities continue to treat it as a viable lead, one that may require time and more advanced analysis to unravel. Amid all this uncertainty, one detail stands apart for its clarity. At exactly 2:28 a.m. on February 1st, Nancy's pacemaker registered a disconnection. Unlike witness accounts or reconstructed timelines, this data comes directly from a medical device, objective, precise, and unaffected by human interpretation. It marks the moment she was likely moved and anchors the entire timeline of the abduction. Just 8 minutes later, another fragment of the puzzle appears. A vehicle was captured on Ring camera footage approximately 2.5 miles from her home at 2:36 a.m. Investigators have yet to identify it. As Nanos explained in March, it remains one among countless vehicles traveling at that hour, difficult to isolate, even harder to trace with certainty. And so, the case remains suspended between fragments of clarity and gaps that refuse to close. A glove that led to the wrong person. DNA that resists interpretation. A precise timestamp without a clear sequence of events. And a vehicle, moving through the darkness, still without an identity. After 65 days, this is where the investigation stands. A real suspect, clearly captured on camera, still unidentified. DNA recovered from inside the home, still without a match. A promising glove lead, now closed. A precise pacemaker timestamp marking a critical moment. An unknown vehicle moving through the timeline without a name. And at the center of it all, a sheriff under intense internal pressure, defending the integrity of a crime scene that a former high-ranking official has publicly described as compromised. It is at this point that Chris McDonough's framework begins to shift from online speculation into something more substantial, a question that demands to be addressed. His argument is not one of conspiracy or misconduct, but of psychology. Specifically, he points to cognitive dissonance, a well-documented phenomenon where an established narrative begins to reinforce itself, making it increasingly difficult for investigators to recognize or pursue information that contradicts it. According to McDonough, investigators may have unintentionally aligned themselves with the family's early framing of the case. From the beginning, the family were the first on scene, the first to interpret what they saw, and the first to publicly define the situation as a ransom kidnapping. That perspective, he argues, became the dominant lens, one that has continued to shape both public understanding and investigative direction, without being independently challenged. It's important to note that McDonough himself is not officially credentialed within this case. He is an online analyst, but the framework he references is not fringe. It is grounded in extensive academic research. In 2006, law professors Keith Findley and Michael Scott of the University of Wisconsin Law School published a landmark paper titled The Multiple Dimensions of Tunnel Vision in Criminal Cases. That work has since become one of the most cited pieces in criminal justice reform, referenced by organizations such as the Innocence Project and justice departments across multiple countries. And its central conclusion is both subtle and unsettling. Tunnel vision in investigations is rarely the result of bad actors or intentional wrongdoing. More often, it emerges naturally, through human psychology, through early assumptions, through the quiet reinforcement of a single narrative over time. Which raises a difficult possibility in this case. Not that investigators ignored the evidence, but that the framework guiding how that evidence is interpreted may have been set long before the full picture ever came into view. What makes this framework so compelling, and so unsettling, is that it doesn't rely on the idea of bad actors. As Keith Findley and Michael Scott documented, this is a natural cognitive tendency, something present in every human mind, including highly trained investigators and forensic experts. In the context of a criminal investigation, however, that tendency becomes dangerous, because the decisions being made are often irreversible. They describe this phenomenon as the result of multiple cognitive forces working together. Confirmation bias leads individuals to interpret new information in ways that support what they already believe. Hindsight bias makes past decisions feel more obviously correct than they actually were. And outcome bias shifts focus away from how a decision was made, judging it instead by how things ultimately turned out. Individually, each is subtle. Together, they can reshape an entire investigation. What follows is a pattern that can be difficult to detect from the inside. Investigators form an initial theory, a working model of what happened, and from that point forward, incoming evidence is filtered through it. Information that supports the model is amplified. Information that challenges it is minimized, overlooked, or explained away. And critically, this effect is not limited to detectives or prosecutors. The research found it extends to forensic scientists as well. In controlled studies, examiners who were given background narratives before analyzing physical evidence often reached conclusions that aligned with that narrative. The evidence itself had not changed, but their interpretation of it had. The National Academy of Sciences echoed this concern in a 2009 review, warning that contextual bias can influence even the most technical forensic disciplines. Real-world cases reinforce the same pattern. The Innocence Project, reviewing over 170 DNA exonerations, found that tunnel vision was a recurring thread, not always the sole cause of wrongful convictions, but the environment that allowed errors to persist. Misinterpreted evidence, overlooked leads, and unchallenged assumptions were able to survive far longer than they should have, protected by the momentum of a dominant narrative. And in high-profile cases, that effect intensifies. When an investigation unfolds under public scrutiny, media attention, and political pressure, the cost of questioning the established narrative becomes significantly higher. Challenging it can mean reputational risk, institutional friction, even public backlash. And so, over time, the narrative hardens, not necessarily because it is correct, but because it has become the easiest version of events to maintain. In a case like this, the influence of the victim's family cannot be separated from the investigative environment. They are credible, they are grieving, and they have been the most visible, consistent public voice from the very beginning. To question their account is not just an analytical exercise, it carries social and professional consequences, especially in a case under national attention involving a high-profile figure. Research has long warned about this exact dynamic. When there is pressure to produce answers quickly, combined with a strong early narrative, the conditions are ideal for tunnel vision to take hold and intensify. And when you map those conditions onto this investigation, the parallels become difficult to ignore. Law enforcement did not encounter an untouched scene. By the time they arrived, the family had already been inside for up to an hour, observing, interpreting, and emotionally processing what they found. The first understanding of that scene came through them. Then, before any ransom note had even surfaced, the theory of a kidnapping for ransom was introduced by the family itself, and publicly reinforced before investigators had formally confirmed its validity. From that point forward, the pattern continued. The family became the primary voice interpreting which communications were real. The crime scene was later described as compromised by a former sheriff who once led the same department. Evidence was sent to a private lab rather than the FBI, despite federal resources being available. The standard chain of command appeared blurred when the sheriff personally announced the reopening of the scene. Internally, deputies voted unanimously against their own leader. Externally, county officials moved to compel sworn testimony. And yet, 65 days into the investigation, the core questions remain unanswered. No arrest. No identified suspect. No clear explanation for why Nancy's home was targeted. This is where the argument put forward by Chris McDonough, and reinforced, in part, by Carmona's public criticism, shifts from speculation to something more substantive. The question is no longer whether mistakes could have been made, but whether the investigation has ever paused to formally reassess itself. Because in high-profile cases, the academic and legal literature is clear. There should be a structured, independent re-evaluation of the dominant theory, one conducted outside the framework established in those first critical hours. And the absence of that kind of rethinking may be just as significant as any piece of missing evidence. The purpose of that kind of review is often misunderstood. It is not about accusing the family, nor is it about dismissing forensic evidence. It is about something more precise, ensuring that the narrative formed in those first critical hours, the open doors, the blood, the early ransom framing, has been rigorously tested from the outside, rather than simply reinforced by evidence interpreted within it. In the research world, this process has a name, and more importantly, a track record. It has been formally adopted in criminal justice systems that have confronted the consequences of tunnel vision firsthand. The Canadian government recommended it after examining wrongful convictions nationwide. The Netherlands went further, building entire investigative reform programs around it. And organizations like the Innocence Project continue to advocate for it in cases where early narratives and public pressure intersect. But here, one key question remains unanswered. Has that kind of independent review been applied in this investigation? Has anyone outside the core team been brought in, not to support the existing theory, but to challenge it? To test its limits? To look for what might have been missed? As of now, there has been no public confirmation that such a step has taken place. What has been stated publicly, however, adds another layer of complexity. In March 2026, Sheriff Nanos told NBC Nightly News that investigators believe they understand why Nancy's home was targeted, and that the attack itself was deliberate. Yet, he stopped short of certainty, acknowledging he could not confirm that conclusion with complete confidence. He also did not rule out the possibility that the same perpetrator could strike again, and emphasized that certain details must remain undisclosed to protect the integrity of the case. At the same time, outside legal perspectives suggest a different interpretation of the silence. Las Vegas-based defense attorney Peter Christensen told Newsweek that the lack of public updates may indicate a shift in strategy, from broad information gathering to what he described as clinical evidence consolidation. In other words, investigators may have moved beyond sorting through tips and are now focused on narrowing possibilities through verification, digital tracing, and forensic analysis. And that leaves the case in a tense, uncertain space between what is being withheld, what is being pursued behind the scenes, and what has yet to be fully questioned in the light. Retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent Lance Lysing offered a measured perspective. Silence from experienced investigators does not always signal a lack of progress. In some cases, it can mean the opposite, that something significant is developing behind the scenes. At the same time, he acknowledged a harder truth. With every passing day, evidence degrades, memories fade, and viable leads become more difficult to pursue. Both realities can exist at once. So yes, the investigation may be moving forward in ways the public cannot see. There may be a thread being quietly followed, a lead being carefully built. But the known facts, the ones already on record, still demand attention. The delayed first contact with the scene. questions surrounding its integrity, the internal turmoil within the sheriff's department, DNA evidence that has yet to identify a suspect, and a man, clearly captured on camera, who has not been found. These elements do not stand alone. They exist alongside a growing argument, one raised by independent analysts and now echoed, in part, by a former sheriff, that the conditions surrounding this investigation may have influenced how it has unfolded. And within that broader context, one detail from CBS News reporting around day 45 becomes especially significant. Investigators had access to far more surveillance than just the doorbell camera. Additional cameras positioned at the back of the house, as well as covering the driveway and garage, recorded weeks of activity leading up to the abduction. That footage was thoroughly reviewed. Family members, regular visitors, landscapers, pool workers, every routine presence was accounted for. Nothing unusual was flagged. And yet, one absence stands out. The masked individual seen at the front door does not appear in any of that prior footage. Not once. Not in the days, not in the weeks before. Which suggests something critical about his behavior. Whoever he is, he operated with precision. He avoided predictable paths. He did not approach in ways that would expose him to the wider surveillance network on the property. The only time he appears is when he is already at the door, already in control of what the camera can and cannot see. And that level of discipline raises a new question, not just who he is, but how carefully this was planned long before anyone knew to look. Whoever this individual is, one thing becomes increasingly clear. He either knew exactly where the cameras were positioned, or he exercised enough caution to avoid them entirely. That level of awareness aligns closely with former Pima County homicide detective Kurt DeBra's assessment. This property was almost certainly surveilled in advance. This was not random movement. It was controlled, deliberate, and informed. And if you followed this case closely, then you already feel the shift. The more details emerge, the less this investigation answers, and the more it raises new, sharper questions. That's why cases like this demand more than passive attention. They require focus, discipline, and a willingness to stay engaged even when the information slows and the silence grows louder. Because here is where things stand, 65 days in. No arrest. A suspect captured on camera but still unidentified. DNA that has yet to produce a name. And a former sheriff openly stating that the crime scene itself may have been compromised. In that kind of environment, the pressure does not fade, it intensifies. Not just on investigators, but on anyone paying attention. Because when answers are limited, the responsibility shifts to asking better questions, more precise ones, grounded not in speculation, but in careful observation. And right now, those questions matter more than ever.